Storytellers! Welcome to Bound by Words. If we haven't met yet, my name is Madie. I am a full-time editor and fantasy writer, and today we're talking about 5 ways to improve your storytelling. Now, we talk a lot about, like novel writing and fiction and fantasy on this channel, but this will be storytelling in every, medium. So whether you do, oral tales or video games, whatever your poison is, we're going to be talking about how to improve storytelling as an art form. And we're not going to do the classic tips of, limit adjectives and, speak slowly or add drama. We're not going to do any of those super overplayed tips. These are 5 less common and hopefully easy to implement tips to improve your storytelling right away. Tip number 1 is say less. And I feel like this can be said 1,000 different ways. We always tell people don't info dump, show over tell, stuff like that. But in general, when I say less, I literally mean we're not going to overwhelm our audience. Saying less isn't just refraining from those info dumps, it's also giving our audience just enough that they need to get the story moving and to have questions flowing in their head, but also not overwhelm them with information to remember or think about or connect together. So if you're going through, even if you're just oral storytelling and you're going through the history of something, if you're talking about family lines and religious beliefs and stuff without pause, then it's going to feel really droning, sort of like a textbook. So whenever you're telling a story in any variety, think is this information important to say now, or can the story still be told without it? Now, a lot of people think that this is black and white, do you need this? Yes or no? Cut it out. But there is a gray area where some information could be very important to the story or the world, but at the same time, if it was removed, you could still tell the story. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. Really crack down on that and say as little as possible to your audience or your reader while still getting your story and your themes and your voice across. Now, when I'm telling stories in real life, I'm one of those people who falls victim to the mind map mentality where I start telling a story and then I have to branch off and give you some extra little information and then come back and then maybe branch off in another direction. I'm totally guilty of that. So this is more about organized storytelling and just perfecting it as an art form is really getting a handle on that from the get-go. Some people are really good at naturally only saying what's necessary, and I'm not really saying make your story short. There are some really good stories that are 1,000 pages long, but the point is if you include information that isn't necessary to what is happening in the moment or what is going to be happening in the near future, it might give your readers and your audience a little bit too much to juggle and something's gonna give. If you give them a lot of information that doesn't matter and then you move on, they're gonna forget the information that's not relevant if it becomes relevant later in the story. So we don't want to overwhelm them with things in the beginning to prep their mind for something that's gonna happen later. We just want to prep their mind for the experience they're having in the moment. Prepare for the next couple pages or the next chapter. You don't have to prepare them in the beginning of the story for how the story is going to end. Chapter 1 doesn't usually strongly correlate with chapter 50, which ties pretty closely into way number 2 to improve your storytelling is to include non-repetitive reminders. There are a few reasons why I think this is incredibly important, but as an editor, one of the things I do the most is to eliminate repetitive words, phrasing, things like that. Including it in your writing or storytelling has a little bit of a negative effect on your reader. It feels almost like talking down to them or being condescending. So one of the more popular writing advice you'll see and storytelling advice in general is to make sure you're writing to an intelligent reader or make sure you're telling your story to an intelligent audience. And the reason why is because if your audience feels like you are over-explaining things, then they're immediately going to assume they aren't the target audience. I think in my life I've only DNF'd 2 or 3 books. Very few books. I'm a huge fan of actually just reading a book to the end, even if I don't love it, just for the experience. I can read a book to the end and go, didn't like that at all, and put it away and be fine with it. But one of the books that I DNF'd was one that I had felt like it was really over-explained and simplified. It had a lot of cliche language, and I had the impression in the first 50 or 60 pages that it was written towards a much younger audience, middle grade or younger probably, and then about like 80 pages in or so, there was like suddenly a lot of swear words, and it was really confusing to read because my brain was like, okay, clearly this is not written for a child, it's written for a really dumb adult. So the non-repetitive reminders are ways to incorporate reminders to help your readers along in the story and help them to draw connections without having that like slight tone of condescension. For example, if your main character has a sibling and they might be in the beginning of the story and then disappear and then pop up somewhere later in the story, like halfway through, we all know that cliche line where it's like, hey brother, hey sister, and it's so unbelievable. Really, people don't talk like that, and it's something that a lot of people comment on when it comes to amateur writing instead of those reminders, because a lot of writers do that because they don't know how else to remind the audience that these people are related. But an easy fix to that would be something like one of the characters saying, hey, mom said to tell you this, which indicates that they have the same mom and that they are related. It's a great way to remind the audience that there's a connection there without having to repeat it or say something that's super cliche or like overworked. Another good example of this is like feelings and emotions when it comes to likes and dislikes. So if somebody like really doesn't like scary stories or like scary movies whatsoever, maybe they just get terrified easily. If that character comes into a room, maybe like your protagonist is sitting with a few other people watching a scary story, and this person who hates scary stories comes into the room, instead of saying, oh, I couldn't believe a scary story was on, or instead of having some like cheesy or cliche or repetitive dialogue exchange or thought process, it is a lot easier to just describe that person's emotional reaction to the story. Maybe they notice the scary story is on, the scary movie, and they tense up a little bit, do whatever they needed in the room, and then leave as quickly as possible. Maybe while they're standing in the room just needing some information from one of the other characters, maybe there's like a jump scare and they like actually tense up and physically jump, and it might be a little bit humorous to the other characters in the room, but it is a good non-repetitive reminder that that fear exists. Now, these reminders are really, really important in reading because it is what makes your characters and your story feel real and tangible, and it lends to a lot of powerful storytelling elements. Like if you want a red herring or if you want a plot twist, you're gonna have to have these like constant little nuggets of information that give your reader the impression that something is happening. Like a plot twist is essentially you're giving your reader all these like little nuggets leading them to believe one thing, which they're all non-repetitive reminders, sowing like a seed in your audience's mind that something is going to happen, and then the plot twist sort of shell shocks them because they had already been convinced to believe this other thing. So the non-repetitive reminders are, I think, something that really strongly separates amateur storytellers from like professional feeling storytellers, and I highly recommend it. It's something that everyone should practice. Tip number 3 to improve your storytelling, and this one is instantaneous, is to be confident in the facts of your story. I think something that hurts a lot of stories is if the person telling the story doesn't seem very sure of the things that are literal facts in the story or world that they are describing. I think that this is most obvious whenever you're describing a fantasy book to either somebody who doesn't read or somebody that you might think that they might be on the fence about the idea. And the reason why is because when you start to explain the story out loud, it starts to feel a little bit silly. When you lose that confidence in the way you're speaking, that's what makes things feel silly. If the way that you're writing and you're talking about things that are happening in the book does not feel set in stone or for sure, then why would your readers believe it if you don't believe it? You know what I mean? So if you have like different customs or habits that are appropriate and right in your story, whether you're just oral storytelling or writing, say them confidently, say them firmly. Just like the last point, this is something that really separates amateur storytellers from professionals. It's something that I actually admire in people who are able to tell stories on the spot, like adults who just sit down and say, okay kids, I'm going to tell you some interesting bedtime story, and they just start spinning an elaborate tale with confidence that is super believable. I firmly believe that it is the confidence behind the fact that they are able to just create fiction and say it like fact that makes that so like impressive and smooth, if that makes sense. So whenever you are writing fiction, whether it is contemporary or high fantasy, make sure the things that you're saying that are facts are said without question, because that's going to really pull your reader in and make it feel without a doubt like it is normal, which is going to help them get immersed in the story. Tip number 4, this one ties into the first one a little bit, that say less one, but tip number 4 to improve your storytelling is to highlight differences and skim over similarities. And the reason why is because if we are talking about things that are similar to either our real world experiences that we have every day or similar to everything else in the story, we're essentially wasting words and boring our audience. So if we're talking about, like little townhouses and they all look the same, it's not necessarily worth describing like what types of colors they each are. If they're all like muted reds, that's not as important. If you're talking about a big city setting and it's just like every other big city setting where there's tall buildings and busy streets and normal street lights and street signs, there are definitely points in time when like describing and explaining those things is important and relevant to the story, but I wouldn't like spend more time describing things that are ordinary or similar to either other points in your story or things in the real world. Instead, you should spend the majority of the time highlighting the differences. And the reason why is because when you highlight the differences, either if it's between characters or settings or tones, it's going to give your reader and your audience a better mental picture of like the dynamic between characters. It'll help them create that visual in their head where like the more important parts are like formed first, and then the rest, the things that are normal and regular and ordinary and similar, are going to fill themselves in like background noise. I think an example of this like falling flat and not being done correctly is if you have a book and you imagine the character to like appear a certain way. Maybe they have like short brown hair in your head and like big doughy eyes, and then like halfway through the book or halfway through the story, the storyteller says something about their really curly red hair. Now, if they have really curly red hair, like why didn't that come up earlier in the story? Was there never an instance where, that got in the way, or that was frizzy, or like how do they style it? How curly is it? Is it like fro style curly, or does it like hang still, but it's just like really like ringlet curls? There are so many questions there, and I feel like it's one of like the worst moments for a reader whenever you have this mental image of the way a character should look or sound or act, and then the author just throws in a nugget like pretty late in the story. You already have like that idea of them established, and then the author's like, and here's this tidbit that like totally derails what you imagine that character to look or act like. And I will say, whenever that does happen, myself as a reader, I continue to imagine the character how I did in the first place, so it's almost like that comment didn't happen. That's terrible. I know it's not the most accurate thing, but it's just what my brain does, and I assume that most readers' brains function similarly. Maybe they don't, but that's just my assumption. So if you were describing like a group of characters, say there's like 5 girls and they all have really short hair, instead of describing how each one of them has short hair in detail and like what it sort of looks like to give your readers an image, you can say all of their hair was similarly short, and you can skim over that just a little bit. And then you might want to point out that one girl has like a really long face, so her short hair seems really jagged and layered, even though it's almost identical to this other girl's hair who has like a really pointed nose, but her nose has like that little point at the end where it like curves out, so it almost makes her bangs like stick to it. We have a visitor, he insists on helping us talk about storytelling today. He probably wants a hug is probably what he's doing, which is really funny, but we'll give him a hug. But highlighting those little differences, like if they have a really long or sharp face or if they have a pointy nose, will let the reader know sort of what kind of mental image to create compared to each other. If you only say the similarities, or if you spend more time on the similarities than the differences, then it's going to be really hard for your audience to really like create an accurate mental picture. Tip number 5 to improve your storytelling instantly, and this one is going to be, I feel like, a little bit more time consuming, but equally as important, and that is to tell stories in incredibly different genres. I hope you can't hear his purring in the video. But if you write, horror and thriller, maybe try to write like a cozy mystery where it's similar in tone, or it might have similar types of characters, but the like voice and attitude of the story is going to be vastly different. If you write, romance, maybe write a book that ends in heartbreak, or tell a story that ends in heartbreak. The reason for this is it's going to give you experience and exposure to a lot of different tropes and a lot of different ideas that readers like, and it'll help you be able to write or tell a story that is more diverse, but also still fits into the same expectations that readers have. For example, readers, whenever they're reading romance or whenever they want to hear a story on romance, they're expecting a happily ever after or a happily for now. So being able to tell a story that ends in heartbreak might give you some things that will really help you like spice up or just like create depth to your love romance. Like most stories have that like almost win or that false victory. So learning how to tell a good heartbreak story could actually elevate your like moment of despair in your romance story, because you'll learn sort of what that feels like and what the expectations are. I think this is true not just for genres, but also for tones and also for point of view. One of the best ways to get better at doing something is to experiment in different formats and art style within your art. So like within writing or storytelling, tell different types of stories and tell, stories with different tones. I also think this works really well for different mediums within writing. So if you write novels, I think you should try short stories. And I actually wrote a video on why short stories will really improve your novel writing abilities. And if you write short stories, maybe trying long form or poetry. Having that like diversity will give you the ability to sort of turn tropes and ideas on their head. It's a way that a lot of people describe like retellings or taking an old idea and renovating it and making it new and fresh. Things like how A Court of Thorns and Roses is like a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. You wouldn't necessarily think Beauty and the Beast whenever you hear that, but if you hear it after reading the book and being familiar with both stories, you can see how they're very similar. And I really think that a good way to learn how to turn a story on its head like that is by doing like the exact same thing in the opposite tone and the opposite medium and the opposite genre. It's hard to focus with him like trying to bite my hands because I'm not petting him. But anyway, branch out and experiment with different types of storytelling so that you can highlight the parts of your story that hold those tropes that are important to you or that you want to stick to with your reader more. Like I said, if you're writing a romance, having those sad moments is really going to highlight the romance even more. If you have like a thriller, having like the cozy, calm, like safe vibes is really gonna highlight the like suspense and the scary parts of your story like even better. And with that, if you enjoyed this video or learned anything about storytelling, then please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing while you're down there. I post writing related videos twice a week. And as always, if you have any other tips for your fellow writers and storytellers on how to improve storytelling as a craft, leave them in the comments so that we can inspire and encourage each other as we hone our crafts. I'll see you guys next time.